With you this morning. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians and chapter number 3. 1 Corinthians and chapter number 3. So good to be in God's house with all of God's people this morning. I have really been blessed, and I hope you have been as well. We're going to continue in our series, Crazy Grace in the Church of the Insane. And as we have journeyed through the first two chapters of the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, we have really seen insanity on display, and we really haven't even gotten to the most difficult, pressing matters in the life of the church. We've seen them be a church that was divided over many things, including their leadership and their worship and their spiritual giftings, and we're just really getting started. But we saw that Paul, as he began to address this church, began to address them by addressing the nature of wisdom and the great message of wisdom and the great truth of wisdom. And he did so because he looked at what the church was doing and he thought it was so foolish. When we left off last week in 1 Corinthians chapter number 2, we left off with Paul describing for the people a superior type of wisdom that they were not experiencing in the message of the world or in the spirit of the age or in the wisdom of the world. And it was a superior message of wisdom because it was a wisdom that had existed before the world itself had existed. And you know by now that that wisdom was the wisdom found in Jesus Christ, through whom the whole world was created and by whom the world was created and for whom the world was created. Paul said, I am offering to you that wisdom that determined how hot the sun should be, how many stars should be in the celestial places. That wisdom is now offered to you in the message of Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ. And so he challenged the people to see the world through the lens of Jesus Christ and what he'd done on our behalf. That is, that he was saying that you and I need to look at everything in the world through what we have received in Christ Jesus. In short, we were commended to surrender our lives to the cross, that we would live as those who were washed white in a crimson shower, that we are to surrender our thoughts, our minds, and our attitudes to the work of Jesus Christ on our behalf. And really, ultimately, to understand all things through what Jesus Christ has done. That is the message of wisdom. Boy, I was thinking about that this week as I was preparing for 1 Corinthians 3 and just kind of watching the news. And I just have to be honest with you this morning. I can think of no greater message for our present age than that message. That the message of wisdom, the message of Jesus Christ is what we so desperately need. We're living in a time where a nation is tearing itself apart, raging against itself over utter foolishness. We're living in a time where Russia now says that Christian evangelism is to be viewed as a terroristic activity. We're living in a time where thousands of protesters cannot find the compassion to weep over innocent blood that is spilled. We are living in a time when the message of wisdom, the message of Jesus Christ, needs to be brought forth and proclaimed on a daily and regular basis. We are living in a time when the people of grace need to proclaim the message of grace. We are living in a time when the believers in Jesus Christ need to engage the world with the message of grace. That's where we're at today. That was what Paul was trying to address with the Corinthians. As he spoke to them about their disunity, about their foolishness, he wanted to address what was at the heart of their problem, and what was the heart of their problem was their view of the gospel. What was at the heart of their problem was the way they looked at the work of Jesus Christ on their behalf. And so in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2, he proclaims to them again the message of the gospel. And as we come to 1 Corinthians 3, he's going to build upon the concept that he has already declared to us. He's just going to build upon what he's already stated, that you and I must make the message of Jesus Christ, what Jesus did on our behalf, central to everything that we do. And as he comes to 1 Corinthians 3 and he begins to write here, he builds on this concept by introducing us to an analogy, a picture as it were. It's one of the things I love about the apostle so much that he's able to take such deep and marvelous truth and put it into a simple illustration. And here in 1 Corinthians 3, he is going to build the picture, or take our discussion by way of a picture of a builder constructing a great building, namely a temple itself. He's going to describe what it is that he's trying to proclaim through the picture of a builder constructing a temple. Working our way back from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse 16 and 17, he writes, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy and you are that temple." All too often over the years growing up, I heard these verses taken out of their context, and therefore they were really stripped of the power and the majesty that Paul was writing in this moment. If you've been around church life long enough, somewhere along the way, you've heard somebody tell you that these verses refer to our physical maintenance. That is, that we should prevent certain substances or certain items from entering into us, maintaining a solid weight, or that these verses speak about general health concerns. Now, I want to be clear this morning that the Christian faith is the only faith of our major religion of the world that believes in the value of the physical body. Every major religion of the world, except for Christianity, gives the soul a superior value to the body. But in the Christian faith, we see the soul and the body as a complete, cohesive unit. That's why we believe in the physical resurrection from the dead. But that is not what Paul is talking about in this moment. We should take care of our bodies. It's certainly good wisdom, but in reality, what he's talking about is so much more profound than that. And it's the meaning of his words are really found in that last phrase, God's temple is holy and you are that temple. He draws upon the illustration of the Old Testament Jewish temple that rested there in Jerusalem. And upon that, the holiness that he's speaking about is the holiness that rested in the Jewish temple. It was the very presence of God. In other words, the Old Testament Jewish temple was holy because God was in it, because the Holy of Holies existed and God himself dwelt there. And as Paul draws upon this illustration, he's going to explain to us that you and I this morning are holy, not because of our morality or our action or our ability to do all of the right things. You and I, as God's temple, are holy this morning because the Spirit of God dwells in us. This morning, God is in this place, not because we worked him up or invited him here, but rather God is in this place because you brought him here as you have the indwelling of the Spirit of God within you. Through your faith in Jesus Christ, you were given the seal until the day of redemption, and that is the Holy Spirit. So God dwells in you, and that in itself is what makes you holy. Then upon that same illustration, upon the same analogy, the holiness of the temple was prescribed a certain attitude or made possible a certain activity in the Old Testament. And you know what it was? It was sacrifice, but in more common terms, we would call it worship. So the holiness of the Old Testament temple was based on the presence, the indwelling of the Spirit of God. And because it was holy, the temple was a place that was set apart for worship. Upon that imagery, upon that analysis, or upon that analogy, Paul is saying that you and I this morning are holy because of the indwelling of the Spirit of God as God's temple, but we were also consecrated, made holy for a singular purpose in life, for worship. You and I were made for worship this morning. Worship in our song and in our praise. Worship in our sacrifice and in our giving. Worship in our obedience and in our acts of devotion. You and I were made holy. We're given the Spirit of God for the singular purpose of the worship of God. So Paul draws on this analogy of building a temple, and he says to the people, you are God's temple. But anybody who's going to build something knows that there's a process that every building goes through, isn't there? You don't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, I'm going to have a temple, and by the end of the day it's there. There's a process. The first part of that process is you got to stop and evaluate the cost and design the building. And then you got to dig the dirt and push it away. And then you got to lay the foundation. And then all of the building that goes on top of that foundation, it's all a part of a process of building. That process is what Paul wants to speak about, and he wants to use it as a picture of what we are doing in our lives. Back in verses 5 to 9, Paul states the initial part of the process of making us into the temple of God. And he writes these words, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building." You see the picture there, right? And by the way, I think you could stop in this moment and remember back to chapter number 1 when the people were divided over the leadership. Some of them wanted to identify because they thought it was better to identify with Apollos, or others wanted to identify themselves as the disciples of the Apostle Paul, or others wanted to identify themselves as the disciples of Peter because they thought that it was better to do so, to align themselves with one person or another. In ministry, sometimes this is particularly challenging because what happens is we start to think a little bit too much of ourselves. We start to think that the ministry rests upon us, when in reality what Paul was saying in this moment is that it has nothing to do with the servants themselves. It has everything to do with the power of God at work. He was saying that Apollos and Paul and all of the other people, you could fill in any name you wanted to, all of us mean nothing, that there must be a greater foundation. And so his argument is coming full circle. The work of Christ as central to living, as he's proclaimed it in the first 2 chapters, means that now the people, if they're going to be the temple of God, must have the right foundation. And so he asks the question, what is Apollos? It's nothing hard against Apollos. It's not that he doesn't like Apollos, because he goes right immediately after that and he says, what is Paul? His response is that we are nothing. We are not the foundation for God's temple. We are not the foundation for your living. We are simply builders. We are the servants of God. It is up to the sovereignty of God, the purpose of God, the will of God to move in your midst. We are nothing other than just laborers sent into the field. You see, it was God's work in the Corinthians that had produced the results. The effectiveness of this church isn't based upon me or my ability, and I'm thankful to God for that this morning. The effectiveness, the success, as it were, of this church isn't based upon any one of our staff, our support staff, or even the members themselves. The effectiveness of the church is rested upon the goodness and the greatness of Jesus Christ. The foundation of the temple was not suitable in the Corinthian church because of the skill of the worker, but rather it was suitable or unsuitable based upon the essence of what it was made of. What did the foundation need to be made of? More poignantly, what is the foundation for you being the temple of God this morning? Verse number 11, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid in Christ Jesus. Jesus is the foundation. You see how his argument's coming back around. Chapters 1 and 2 were all about Jesus Christ being central to our thinking, Jesus Christ being central to our living, Jesus Christ, the work of Christ, being the way in which we view the entire world. Now he says, if I was going to put it in an illustrative way, if I was going to describe you as a temple being built up by God for God's use, I would say it like this: the foundation of your living must be Jesus Christ. A few years back, I was with a crew from our church that I was serving in. We were on a building project helping to build another church not that far from here. Actually, we were either in Salisbury or in Marceline. I don't really remember, but I remember when we arrived with the crew that we showed up and we were there just to kind of get the building in the dry. The walls had all been erected, and it was our responsibility to put the roof trusses on, and then we were going to nail on the roof itself the sheets of the roofing, and even we were going to try our best to get the building completely in the dry, including windows, by the end of the week. Much to our horror, when we showed up, what we found out was that some of the walls were not quite in the right place. And so a discussion arose about what we were supposed to do. Because some of the folks from the church that were there, they said, hey, this is not your problem. You were brought here to get it in the dry. You don't worry about it. You just go ahead and do that, and we'll worry about it later. And so some of our folks were kind of laughing, thinking, well, you're going to start trying to move walls after we put the truss on. Wouldn't it be simpler? And so this kind of discussion goes back and forth until eventually someone kind of said a flippant remark. They said, oh, the sheetrockers will fix it, right? And if you've been around building very long, you know that this is the process. Whenever a mistake is made, you just pass it on to the next guy. He can fix it for you, right? And so if the sheetrockers can't fix it, then the painters will cover it up. And if the painters don't cover it up, we'll just put some trim over it until eventually you have a house that's full of mistakes. And as this discussion's going on, people are kind of laughing. One of my great friends who had a construction company his whole life, he says, well, listen, boys, this is how this works, right? The house gets done, the building gets done, and the painters, when they cover a mistake, they say, well, that was the finisher's fault. The finishers say, well, it was the fault of the folks that hung the sheetrock. The sheetrockers say, well, it was the fault of the people who framed it. The people who framed said, well, it was really the fault of the foundation. And his point was that if the foundation isn't right, then nothing else in the building can be right. Here's the point that I want to make with that this morning. So it is with your life. This morning, if the foundation of your life isn't Jesus Christ, then you cannot be surprised when you look around and your house is not in order. That was Paul's message in this moment to the Corinthians. The reason your house isn't in order is because you have not given due diligence to the foundation. There is one singular foundation, and that foundation is Jesus Christ and Him alone. You can put all the trim that you want. You can decorate with the most beautiful trinkets. You can paint a masterpiece of colors and collages. But if the foundation is wrong, no amount of mud and tape will ever fix the cracks that will appear on your wall. You've got to have a solid and right foundation. And the Corinthians, like many Christians today, wanted to address all the peripheral issues without acknowledging that there was a faulty foundation in place. Beloved, only when your life is built on the foundation of Christ, and by that I want to be specific this morning. By that I mean that everything in life revolves around the work of Jesus Christ on your behalf. Will your house be in order, and will you be prepared for authentic worship? Only when the foundation is Jesus Christ, when everything revolves around His work on your behalf, will your house really come into order and you be ready for authentic worship. Paul saw himself in this process as nothing more than one who had been appointed to the task of laying that initial foundation. He had come to preach the gospel of Jesus, and the people had received it, they had accepted it, but he wasn't there to be their foundation, and neither was Apollos, and neither was Peter. The one person that could be the church's foundation was Jesus Christ. He held that supreme position in their existence. The bulk of his message from this point forward throughout the rest of the book all turns out to be about what the people are laying on that foundation. Or to put it practically, from this point forward, he's really going to speak to the church about what they were doing as a direct result of their acceptance of Jesus Christ. If Jesus is the foundation, what are you adding to the building? It's a popular message in the New Testament. Jesus would say that a tree is known by its fruit. The Apostle John would write that no one can say that he's in the light but continue to walk in the darkness. The Corinthians were building upon that foundation. The actions of their lives were what they were adding to what Paul had preached and they had accepted. Jesus was the foundation, and they were adding to it. And Paul's message to them for the rest of the book is essentially, be careful what materials you use. Be careful what you decide to put on that foundation. Be careful about what you decide of how to act and think and mind yourself. Be careful what you decide that you are going to add to God's temple, to the foundation of Jesus Christ. Verses 12 to 13, he states, "Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, with wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done." It's a simple illustration when you think about it. The foundation of a building determines what it is, whether it's a home, a bunker, a factory, whether it's just a garage, a church, whatever it is. The foundation determines the size and the scope, right? But what gets added to that foundation is really what that building is becoming. It could be built of a lot of different materials. But I'm yet to see a bank show up to a house and do an appraisal and go down and look at the foundation. They look at what the furnishings are. What was it that you put on top of that foundation, right? They want to know all that's on top of it, because the foundation decides what the building is, but what you add onto it is what the building is becoming. You can add a lot of things. A builder has a lot of things at their disposal. They can do it out of stone. They can use brick or vinyl siding or ephes. The list of possibilities are endless. But the value of the building, indeed the very sustainability of the building, is determined by what is built upon that foundation. What type of furnishings are going to be in it? Carpet, hardwood floors, tile, linoleum, the list goes on. Paul draws upon this illustration by commenting that the Corinthians had to choose in their lives between gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw. What are you going to make your temple out of? The foundation is Jesus, but what are you actually going to lay on that foundation? With each successive material, he works the building down in its value, doesn't it? Not only does he work the building down in each successive material down in value, but he actually describes a recession in sustainability or equality, right? Let me illustrate it very simply to you this morning. I heard a story once about 3 little pigs, right? The first little pig built a house out of straw. And one day a big bad wolf comes to it and he says, little pig, let me in. To which a response comes back, no, not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. Then the big bad wolf responded back, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. And the house comes tumbling down and the big bad wolf eats the pig. What are we giving to our children in their nursery school books, right? This big bad wolf had apparently a big appetite, and so he goes to a second pig who had built his house out of sticks. And so he says, little pig, let me in. And the pig says, no, not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. Backwards, the wolf responds, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. And down went the house. And the wolf ate that little pig as well. Apparently the farmer wasn't very smart, and so he wasn't moving his pigs. And this wolf apparently had a very large stomach. And so he decides to go to a third pig. Only this pig had spent a little bit more time, and he built his house out of brick and out of stone. And one day that wolf appeared and he said, little pig, let me in. And the wolf, and the response came back, no, not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. In which the wolf said, well, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. But this time he failed. In fact, if you read the original story, and the wolf blows and blows, and when that doesn't work, he tries to trick the pig, but every time the pig outsmarts him, until eventually the wolf tries to sneak in through the chimney and he falls into a cauldron that is boiling, and the pig ends up devouring the wolf. Now read that to your kids right before they go to bed, right? He tells this story, right? And I know it's not a biblical story, but it does get to the heart, what we're trying to teach our kids in that moment. It gets to the heart of what the apostle is saying in this moment. And that is simply this: the material of your house will determine its sustainability. What you choose to make your house out of will determine how well it will last. If the foundation is Jesus Christ, then what is the material that is being built upon him? Well, beloved, the material that he's referring to, this gold and silver and stone and wood and hay and straw, listen, that is our works or our actions that are added to that foundation. How do I know that? Verse 13, the first part of it, each man's works will become manifest. If you picture yourself and your life, all that is in it, as a temple that is being built by God, the foundation of that work is Jesus Christ, the gospel. The foundation of that building is what Jesus Christ has done on your behalf. You have accepted him by faith. Jesus crucified is central to living. But what you do following that profession of faith, what you do, your actions following that great gift of salvation are your addition to the structure. They are your personalization of the building. They are what you are trying to make that building into. Before I press forward, I want to tell you an interesting thought that crossed my mind this week. I was preparing for 1 Corinthians 3 and expounding it to you, and I was thinking about our building process here at the church, and all of a sudden a question came into my mind, and that was this. What is the driving force behind most builders when deciding what material to lay upon the foundation? In other words, what is the singular thing that makes a builder decide what he's going to put on the structure? And for most, the driving force is cost. And here's what I came to the conclusion of. For many Christians, it is exactly the same thing. They weigh the cost of what it means to build on the foundation of Jesus Christ. They want to know, what is it going to cost my budget if I take a stand for Jesus? What is it going to cost my employment if I take a stand for Jesus Christ? What is it going to cost me in social relationships if I take a stand for Jesus Christ? What will it cost me to commit to service, to lead small groups, to teach classes if I commit to Jesus Christ? What will it cost me to be faithful in Jesus Christ? And at the end of measuring those costs, based on the analysis they come up with, many believers surmise that they would rather use a cheap material than build with the good stuff on the foundation of the gospel itself. They would rather spend just 1 hour a week in attendance. They would rather have a few missed Sundays. They would rather not pay a full tithe. They would rather not live eternally with eternity in mind. They would rather use cheap material instead of putting the best material on the greatest gift, the greatest foundation, Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Paul says in verse number 13 that guess what? There's going to come a day when all of us and all of our works will be laid bare. They will be manifest. One of the things that I love most about my wife is that she is a bargain shopper. Don't tell her I said that, all right? I won't, in fact, let her go shopping with many of you heathen ladies because you will lead her into sin. One of the great joys of her life is to come home having found something at an unbelievably low price. She comes strutting in from the garage like a hunter regaling a successful day in the field, and she will come home with some unbelievable story of victory over the evil merchandise store, right? She's so excited. Listen, here's what I would say about that. That may be good in the Guffey household when the preacher's in charge of the bank account, but it's not good for practical living. Many believers live their lives like that. They buy cheap products for their temple, but then they try to push them off as though they were the finest that the world had to offer. One day, Paul says the quality of the material that you use, your works, the actions you've chosen to do, they're going to be displayed. Their substance and their essence will be made known. It will be laid bare. It will all become apparent what you've built your temple into. And when is that day? The second half of verse 13 tells us, for the day will disclose it because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. It's a specific day that he has in mind. It's a day that is symbolized, he says, by the coming of fire. Fire is an interesting component to add to any material, especially the materials that he's listed because of what it does. Fire purifies gold when it's hot enough. Fire refines silver. Fire chars a stone, and specifically with a diamond, it chars away the imperfections. Fire burns the wood slowly, and fire consumes hay and straw. It's the same judgment that Paul will speak of in 2 Thessalonians chapter number 1, specifically in verse number 8, where he pictures the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I don't want to get too caught up in all the prophetic words here, or maybe I should use the term pathetic words, right? The different mindsets of what this is going to look like. But he describes a day when Jesus is going to come back, and he's going to judge the living and the dead on that day. And he's going to look at those who have accepted the gospel and those who have refused the gospel. And he writes in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 that those who have refused the gospel will find out on that day that they have been set apart for an eternal punishment of destruction. But guess what? They will not be alone in that judgment that day. It is that same day that Paul writes of here in 1 Corinthians 3 that you and I are going to be judged on that day as well. Jesus is going to look at how we have built that temple, I want you to notice verse 14 to 15 because I don't want you to get the wrong impression. He writes, if the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work, he says, is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. The difference between the judgment, it's the same day. It is the great coming of Jesus Christ and that great judgment. The difference between the judgment of the believer and the non-believer is the non-believer is cast into an eternal condemnation, into an eternal damnation, into an eternal hell because he has rejected the gospel. But the believer on that day will be judged. His actions will be sorted through. And Paul says that if your actions were eternal, if they were made of the right substance, you will be given a reward. But on the other hand, if they weren't eternal, you will be saved. But your works themselves will be consumed. They will be laid bare. In other words, on that day of judgment, our eternal security is not in call, but rather what we have done and the very motives of what we have done will be laid bare, fully exposed so that everybody can see them. Like a fraudulent painting next to a masterpiece. As you and I stand in that moment compared to the righteousness of Jesus Christ, that day every flaw of our living will be exposed in His righteousness. Even things that I thought I did right will be exposed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Walk through the process with me here of 1 Corinthians 3. The foundation is the work of Jesus Christ, right? Those who build with the right materials upon that foundation, Paul says, they're going to be rewarded. Those who do not build with the right materials, they're going to be exposed. Their actions are going to be laid bare. Now, you and I want to be in that first group, right? We want to be there in that first group that is given that reward. So the next logical question we have to ask is, what are the materials of those actions? Or what specifically are the actions that we should be taking so that we receive that reward? Or what are the actions we should be taking because of the gospel's work in our life? Well, Paul contrasts by way of two lists here, the first three and the second three. The first three are gold, silver, right, and precious stones. What are those actions representative of? Well, it may be a bit of a guess here or a bit of a stretch, but in 1 Peter chapter 1, for example, gold is pictured as purity. It's one of God's colors. It speaks of His purity. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for silver, the root word of it, was kesef, meaning desire or inhibitions. Then in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 16, precious stones are used to speak of the stones that are placed in the crown, or they're used to speak of royalty or majesty. So what Paul could be saying in this moment is that you got to build your life, are you ready? Around purity, around the right desires, and ultimately around an identification in royalty, and an identification in Jesus Christ. Building your life where you capture your mind, capture your thoughts, and you protect your purity. Building a life where the silver represents a change in desires, where your desires begin to be conformed into the image of Christ. Building your life with precious stones is understanding, seeing yourself in the person of Jesus and trying to be more like Him. Then on the other hand are the final three, right? Wood, which could be, some have suggested, symbolized as merit or your goodness. Hay, which may be different than what you're thinking of. It's found in Proverbs 27:25 in the Old Testament. What would happen is when the first shoots of grass would come up, they would clip them off. And so some commentators have said maybe the hay is symbolic of immaturity. Then there's straw, which was used in Exodus 5, for example, as a decomposition material to bring about future growth. It's a waste, it's a stagnation. So again, it may be a bit of a stretch here, but he could be saying in this moment that the eternal works are purity, a change in desire, and a beginning to look like Jesus, while the uneternal, the non-eternal, the intermittent, the fleeting works, guess what they are? They are immaturity. They are living on your own ability. They are sitting around in stagnation, waiting just to die. What a thought. Whatever the case might be, the works are obviously in some complete contrast to one another. The first three are everlasting. They are eternal. They're not consumed. And the last three, are consumed on that day. In short, what's being contrasted on that day is the eternal with that which is not eternal. Building with the right materials is obedience to Jesus Christ. It's purity. It's a change in desire. It's a change in our identity. We become more like Jesus Christ. That's an eternal work to add to the foundation. Spending your life capturing your thoughts and submitting them to Christ. Spending your life growing in your relationship with Christ. Spending your life becoming more like Christ. Those are the eternal works to add to the foundation. Building with the wrong materials is the disobedience to the commands of Christ. It means you live in immaturity. Isaiah came home last night and I was so stinking excited to see that little booger. He'd been gone for a week, and I was done with him this morning, but I was excited to see him last night. And he comes home last night, and he does what he always does. He tries to play real coy and act like, he's sneaking up on me or whatever, and I just ignore him. And so we had a few moments of fun, and then Zariah, sees me, and so, she's daddy's girl, So we start hanging out and goofing around, and guess what? Isaiah wants to get in the middle of it. He's not happy. Zariah and I grabbed some balls, and we're kind of rolling them around, and Isaiah comes over and he starts kicking them away from us. A child destroys, an adult picks up. What are you doing? Eternal works are mature. Non-eternal works are immature. Living in your own strength and your own ability, that's immature. That's not an eternal work. Waiting to sit around and die, that's not an eternal work. There's the message in its two parts in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. First, build your life on the foundation of Jesus Christ. Cherish the gospel, beloved. Eat it, breathe it, sleep it, love it, read it, know it. Be consumed by the gospel. Build your life on that foundation. May every decision be an outpouring of what Jesus Christ has done on your behalf. May the blood of Jesus Christ spilt on Calvary be the blood that pumps through your veins, that makes your decisions for you. And second of all, having laid the foundation of the gospel, make your works eternal. Don't live for the passing, the fleeting pleasures of the world. Don't live in immaturity, stagnation, and childish ways. Don't live for those things that will not matter on that day. Live with eternity in mind. God will not ask you on that day how many games you won. God will not ask you on that day how many dollars were in your bank account. God will not ask you on that day how many prizes that you got because of that hobby. God will not ask you on that day how many words a minute you can type. Live your life with eternity in mind. Live your life and build upon the foundation of Jesus Christ, the works, the actions that will echo through eternity. Make your life count in eternity. Bring people into the kingdom. Love the poor and the marginalized. Seek justice for the oppressed. Live your life making it count for all of eternity. The builder, he will use materials that are appropriate to the value of the house in his heart. If he treasures the house, he will spare no expense. Living for eternity is much the same way. You will build your life with the materials representative of what you treasure in your heart. So I'm telling you, I'm imploring you, I'm begging you, treasure Jesus Christ. Because if you treasure Christ, you'll adorn the temple with little regard to the cost of such extravagance for Jesus. Everything in life will be about making your life count in eternity. An illustration, and I'll close this morning. I want to tell you the story of a little girl that treasured Jesus in her heart. Her name was Cassie Bernal. In the late 90s, Cassie was entering the 9th grade. Her parents sensed something was wrong, and so on her first day of school in that 9th grade year, her mother invaded her privacy and she looked through her room. What she found disturbed her to her very core. Cassie had fallen into drugs, alcohol, and witchcraft. And so her parents found themselves in a dreadful position where they didn't really even know what to do about their child. They prayed about it before they confronted her, and they felt like God called them to move their family to a neighboring subdivision where she could go to a different school and maybe begin to get some new friends. So the family moved to a little place called Littleton, Colorado. Cassie moved, found herself drawn to the same things, the same crowd that her parents were trying to get her away from. But this time her parents put their foot down and they forced her to hang out with somebody new against her desire and against her wishes. That man's name was a youth pastor from West Boyles Community Church. His name was Dave McPherson. McPherson recounted that his initial thoughts upon meeting Cassie were, there is no hope for this young lady, at least not our kind of hope. She had no joy. She spoke with a monotone voice. Her very countenance was dark. McPherson worked on her for quite a while until eventually he talked Cassie into attending a youth event, a retreat away from the church for a weekend, away from their parents. Something changed while she was gone. Her father, Brad, recalled these words. When she left, she was this gloomy, head down, say nothing youth. When she came back, her eyes were open and bright. She was bouncy and just excited about what had happened to her and was just so excited to tell us. He said it was like she was in a dark room and somebody turned on the light and all of a sudden she could see the beauty that was surrounding her all along. Her mother recalled she looked at me in the eye and she said, Mom, I've changed. I've totally changed. I know you're not going to believe it, but I'll prove it to you. The light that had been flipped on in Cassie's life was the light of the gospel of Jesus. She'd experienced transformation. Jesus had radically changed her life. She began to spend her spare time not with the witchcraft crowd, not with the drugs and the alcohol, but rather she began to spend her spare time with her new Christian friends ministering at Denver's inner city Victoria Outreach Church. She would serve dinner to prostitutes and drug addicts. She planned to cut off the hair that hung down the full length of her back. She planned to cut it off and donate it to an organization so that they could weave it into a wig for folks going through chemotherapy procedures. One night out over dinner, she turned to her mom and she said, Mom, it would be okay if I died. It'd be okay. I'd be in a better place, and you know where I'd be. The girl who had been living on the edge of death now welcomed a journey into an eternal resting place. Sunday night, April the 18th, 1999, Cassie was given the opportunity to share her testimony at youth group. She told the group, you really, and I could almost hear a teenager saying this, right? You really can't live without Christ. It's like impossible. It's like impossible to really have a really true love without Him. I love the innocence in such a statement. 2 days later, April the 20th, 1999, Cassie sat at the library of her high school having a Bible study with a fellow student. In a flash, 2 young men entered the library of Columbine High School that day with homemade pipe bombs and guns. The survivor said that one of the members of the now infamous Trenchcoat Mafia walked up to her. He knew exactly who she was. Her Bible was displayed with a WWJD bracelet around her wrist. And he asked her a simple question. Do you believe in God? Kevin Kenninger, who was the young man that Cassie was leading in a Bible study in that moment, he would survive the ordeal, and he would recall that after there was a really long pause, he said, I think she knew she was going to die. And she responded to the gunman, yes, I believe. And in an instant, the trigger was pulled. Following the events of that day, her brother found a quote in her desk. It was a quote from the Living Bible in Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. Now I have given up on everything else. I have found it to be the only way to really know Christ and to experience the mighty power that brought Him back to life again and to find out what it means to suffer and to die with Him. So whatever it takes, I will be the one who lives in a fresh newness of life of those who are alive from the dead. Cassie knew in that moment what it meant to live with eternity in mind. She was making her life count. My question to you this morning would be, how about you? What are you laying on the foundation of Jesus Christ? What have you determined was important? What actions are you building on the foundation that Jesus laid? Stand with me reverently and let's pray. Father.